You and I have to look at this and understand this, that the ballot is as powerful as the bullet.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Hello, and welcome to episode 71 of Only Human, the podcast where we try to take and grow who we are, where we are with the resources at hand. And today we're going to talk about something that has a contemporary importance, but I think it's always been around and probably always will be around, so it will age well. And that is, what do we do about human error? What do we do about human error? Over the past several weeks, specifically in aviation, we have seen a host of tragedies and near misses, or as I like to say, near tragedies, that have plagued the aviation industry. So much so that over the weekend, I saw the new Secretary of Transportation, Duffy, being interviewed about it. And the question was, does the public have a right to start questioning the safety of aviation? Excuse me, just coming back from a little bout of bronchitis. And his answer was interesting. He pointed out the historical safety of professional aviation and tried to put the public's mind at ease. And he pointed out that most of the recent events have their origins in human error. And as he went deeper into that discussion, and they asked, well, what did you do as Secretary of Transportation about human error? He went on to say some things that I found were interesting and probably a little bit narrow-minded. He said, well, when these people are making mistakes like that, meaning crossing the runway without clearance, being off altitude, etc., he said, we have to look at all the things that are possible, including pulling their certificates. So that brought me back to a topic that I've been fascinated with for the past 30 years, and one I even wrote a book on. I know you guys are tired of me holding up books, but called Blue Threat, Why to Err is Inhuman. And the point of the book was that there certainly is some wisdom when you say to err is human, and things like people will always make mistakes. However, there is a hard amount of science that says we don't have to make as many mistakes as we do. So when we throw out those general terms, people are always going to make mistakes. That's a given. You have to fix the system, not the person. We leave too much money on the table, right? There are a lot of errors that if we knew a little bit more about why they occur, specifically why they occur to us, and when they occur, we can really, really cut back on the number and severity of the errors that we make. So that's what today's emphasis is all about. Trying to educate the public. Maybe Secretary Duffy will see this. Hopefully some of you will forward it on and share it wide enough to where he just might. Maybe we'll hashtag him and see if we can get somebody to look at it. And understand that before you pull somebody's certificate and take away their ability to make a living, you need to understand a couple of things. One is there is a huge difference between a willful violation and an inadvertent error. Nobody believes that these recent tragedies were caused by willful violations. Just as certainly, they probably were caused by inadvertent errors. So what can we do about that? And so today's podcast, we're going to talk about inadvertent errors and how we can figure out what to do about those. And it's all starting with you've got to know who you are. So the central thesis to the Blue Threat book and the approach that I have been advocating for over 20 years now is that human error is an individual personal phenomena. And therein lies part of the problem, because what we tend to do is we tend to study error by vocation or by function. So if you look up online pilot error or medical error or even driver's error, you're going to find a ream of studies that look at typical mistakes people make while flying or while operating on another human being or while driving. And that's all well and good, and we need to understand that. But what's more important is that we understand why errors occur to us as individuals. And so throughout the book, I point out that as marvelously unique individuals, forgot to turn off my sound on my phone. As marvelously unique individuals, creations of God, we all have a personal fingerprint of error. And while errors come in many forms and many shapes, typically each one of us has a pattern of only 4 or 5 error types, situations that lead us into doing things that we know we shouldn't be doing. Nobody thinks that for example, that business jet that taxied in front of the Southwest airliner last week that resulted in a go-around and could have been much, much worse, was something that was somebody ignoring a rule. Basically, they missed a couple of air traffic control calls and taxied onto an active runway. But why? Right? And we could come with some real generalized ideas, right? They were distracted. They didn't practice good teamwork, right? They weren't answering the radio calls as specifically as they should have, right? Those are pilot errors. But only the individual themselves in that cockpit know what was going on in their head. And so in order to be able to figure that out, in order for you and I to be able to figure that out, we have to take a close look at our entire life and why we make mistakes when we drive, in our business environment, in our home environment, during our hobbies. All of those things, when you study it, will lead you to one inescapable conclusion. And I base this on, like I said, 20 years of research on myself. And oh, by the way, many, many others who I've taught this approach to. And that inescapable conclusion is there are 4 or 5 common things that are going on in the background when we make mistakes. So what are they and how do we discover those? Well, here's the first part. And quite frankly, it's the hardest part of the entire process, because once this is done, the rest of it gets very, very easy. I've spent a lot of time looking into human error, and I tried to codify, list various types of errors. And in this book, I talk about them a lot. So I'm going to page back here to a dog-eared page I have somewhere. And I'm just going to run down the types of errors. And don't turn me off for a minute here, because there are a lot of them, right? On the list that I have here of common situational factors, psychological factors, environmental factors that play into error, there's, I think, 48 different things. And in order to be able to analyze your own performance or someone else's performance, you need to know what these things are. Now, that's not an infinite amount of stuff, but it is some little bit of heavy lifting. So let me just go over a few of them. It starts out here with error-producing conditions, right? Physiology and fatigue, right? We kind of get that one. High risk, low frequency events. Maybe need to do a little bit thinking about that one. Time pressure. Something called low signal to noise ratio. Normalization of deviance. Information overload. Poor communication. Faulty risk estimations. Inadequate standards. There's a few more, but you get the gist of it. So that's just in one section called error-producing conditions. The next one's called violation-producing conditions. Now, these are things that would tempt us to cross a line willfully, and they're worth mentioning here. Ego, mission expectation, unlikely detection, poor planning, leadership gap, poor role models, or a unique or special event. Those are all things that kind of throw us off guard and lead us across the line of compliance. Then there's hazardous attitudes, anti-authority, impulsiveness, feeling bulletproof, too competitive, that macho attitude, right? Resignation, giving up, pressing too far into a situation, emotional jet lag. That's kind of when you become a tourist after you make a mistake. Oh my gosh, my brain stays where I made the mistake, but the situation continues to unfold. Procrastination or delays in making decisions. Those are all hazardous attitudes. Then we get down into the biases that we've talked about before: expectation bias, confirmation bias, specialty bias, something called framing error, where we don't frame the problem for what it actually is. Fundamental attribution error and other types of framing problems where we want to attribute it to something that makes it not our fault, right? And then the last one are group dynamic traps. Strength of the first idea, groupthink, excessive deference to authority, lack of assertiveness. So you can see the list is fairly long. So let's switch for a second. If you'll just accept this notion that I have that we can learn those things. There's a lot of them. Some of them make sense. Some of them we need to learn a little bit more about, but there's a finite number of them, and we learn what those are. The next thing we need to do is have a process for seeing how often they occur to us, and when, and where, and sometimes even with whom, right? And those are situational factors. Now, once you have those understanding that if we knew those things, we could figure out what types of mistakes we make, then we're into the process, right? So the process for understanding our unique individual fingerprint or thumbprint of error is to look at the mistakes that we make every day, routinely in our normal lives. And that's hard to do because a lot of us tend to equate a mistake with a bad outcome. And the vast, vast majority, 95% or more of the mistakes we make do not have any bad outcome. Oh, I got a flickering light here now. I'm going to let it go. See if it keeps going. So most of you are listening and not watching anyway. So what I've done, and I did this for myself, but I basically created a form. You probably can't see that very well, but it's a form that says date, time, right? Background, what was going on, action taken, what did you do, consequence or potential consequence. Right? And so I've been doing this for a long, long time. I have one well over, I'm going to estimate, but last time I counted it was 7,500, so I got to be close to 10,000 errors that I have personally made that I track. And I basically do this at the end of any project or serious effort during the day. I'll sit down and I say, where did I make a mistake, right? I didn't communicate well enough. I didn't proofread enough. I had some bad expectations going into it. suffered a little confirmation bias and thought I knew what was going on. I didn't really. So I will check those over here on the side, right? And I don't care whether it was a good outcome or a bad outcome. I don't even care if I think the things that I noticed on this list of the 48 error-producing conditions, violation-producing conditions, hazardous attitudes, I don't care if I think they caused that mistake. All I care about is, were they present at the time when the mistake was made? With that data, I am able to then collate that and look at 15, 20 mistakes I've made over the past few days and see that there's a few things that are commonly present. And now we're beginning to understand our personal fingerprint of error. So to cut to the chase, for me, there are 3 or 4 conditions and attitudes and situational factors that cause me to make my most significant and frequent mistakes. And here they are. The first one, and I think a lot of you will resonate with this, time pressure. I put too much on my plate. I procrastinate too much. We've talked about that on a previous podcast. And that gets me behind, and I've got to hunker down, not do my highest quality work, and mistakes creep in. So time pressure, probably number 1. Number 2 is kind of a weird one, and it might apply, only to me. I'm sure there's some other people out there like me, and that is my over-competitive nature, right? Competition. When I think that I am in competition with another writer, another speaker, another thinker, CEO, company, family member, it doesn't matter. When I suddenly put myself in that competitive mode, I am likely to make more mistakes. Golf course, oh my gosh. Now, having a competitive streak is not necessarily a bad thing, right? I wouldn't be where I am without it, and I enjoy competition. So I'm not going to shy away from competition. What I am going to do, though, is be aware that it's one of those things that can cause me to make a serious mistake. Right? So that's number 2. Number 3 is fatigue. I try my hardest to be in bed at the same time every night. By 10 p.m., I am lights out, doing a little light reading, saying my evening prayers, and throwing my head on the pillow every single night that's possible for me. And yet, that doesn't always happen, right? Or I get woken up in the middle of the night, or I just wake up in the middle of the night, worried about something or thinking about something, whatever it is, and it turns out I don't get a good night's sleep. Or if I'm on the road, I never sleep well in hotels. So I begin to recognize when I am set up for a fatigue-inducing error. I've got a couple more, but those 3 are enough to illustrate that if I'm in a competitive situation, I'm fatigued, or I'm behind the timeline, I need to be overly cautious. I call it a yellow flag for making mistakes. I double check my work. I'm careful before I hit send on emails. All of those things. All right, so what's this got to do with Secretary Duffy, aviation, human error, any of those things? Quite a bit. Because if we want people to stop making errors that result in tragedy, right? That helicopter on the Potomac flying 100 feet off altitude. Now, 100 feet off altitude doesn't seem like much, right? Unless you're flying underneath the final approach course of a major international airport. Then it's a lot, right? So I wonder how many times those pilots, I know I certainly have, flown 100 feet off altitude without correcting back toward exactly where I am supposed to be. How much tolerance how much sloppiness had I allowed to infect my flying, right? It's the same thing in everything you do. When you begin to allow yourself a little latitude left or right of what I call top dead center perfect, you are redefining your boundaries, and they will naturally expand causing you to make errors. So, this has been a fast and dirty kind of overview on human error and what we can do about it. In our own personal lives, we can begin to think about ourselves as mistake-making machines and try to begin to improve that, right? To get ourselves synchro-meshed to where when we find our error-producing conditions, our violation-producing conditions, we go on high alert. And we will begin to see fairly rapidly, I might add, those numbers of mistakes to decrease. So what does that mean for big industries? I think it means we need to train this. If we want error-free performance in high-risk industries, we need to teach people not about pilot error, or nuclear power mechanical error, or doctor error. We need to teach people how to discover their own personal fingerprint of error. And quite honestly, I've been preaching this for 20 years, and every once in a while there is a cluster of events that lets me talk about it again, and so I am. But I am absolutely 100% convinced that error control lies inside of the capability of those closest to the controls, closest to the factors that cause us to make errors, and not in some vast system that says, well, we need to write another procedure, or we need to work on better teamwork training. All those things are valid and relevant, but it's not the root cause of what makes you and I so frequently fall off of really high quality performance into the region of error. We have to be able to understand ourselves well enough, and we must be open and honest and objective with ourselves so that we can identify those flaws. And they're not character flaws, they're classic logic flaws and laws of physiology that press in against all of our high performance capabilities. And once we do that, and we get to know ourselves better, I like to say you make a new friend, and it's the one looking back at you in the mirror every day. Okay? And I'll tell you, once you get into this, it's like a flywheel. You get that continuous improvement flywheel going, and it will become easier. It'll become more efficient, and eventually it becomes second nature. Right? So that's really it for our short podcast today. I think we said episode 71, pretty hard to believe. And next week, we're going to get back to talking a little bit more about how these things impact the regulator, the original equipment manufacturer, an organization that's trying to come to grips with human error, and some of the really good things they can do, one of which is help people learn about their personal fingerprint of error. But there are other things as well. Not casting a big blanket of blame, not threatening to pull somebody's certificate so that their stress levels go up, and they're so focused on not making a mistake that they're not ready for a surprise event, what we call startle effect in aviation. So we're going to talk more about that in the future, and then probably the week after that and the week after that, we'll have a special guest to come on so you can hear somebody's ideas other than my own. So like always, thanks so much for joining us. Remember to share hashtag Secretary Duffy if you can. Maybe we'll get inside his decision space and see if we can get this out there a little further and wider. And until then, keep doing what you're doing where you are with the resources at hand, and I will see you soon.